evening and welcome. Thank you very much for joining us tonight. It's very nice to see so many people here. My name is Matthias Sperling and I am a choreographer and a performer, and I am working together with Guido on a scientific research collaboration at the moment.
And this is where this event comes in. So, my name is Guido. I'm a cognitive neuroscientist, and I'm particularly interested in how we perceive and do actions. And, the research project that really is at the core of all of this is about an application or a sort of research project that we put together, which is about cooperation in dance. And this is part of what is called a transformative research project, which is how it is funded. And we believe that it was transformative because we brought together dance, in this case Matthias, and science in a very particular way. And working on this topic, cooperation in dance, Matthias made a piece for us, with which we worked and which was the basis for our research. And in the process of working together from both an artistic perspective and a scientific one, we had a lot of questions, or a lot of things worked very well, but there were certain issues or certain things that we realized were actually worth talking about and were worth also sharing with a wider audience. And we basically have a lot of questions which we weren't able to answer, and this is where our distinguished panel of experts comes in, both from a dance and a neuroscience background. But before we introduce them, I think there's a little thing we want to...
Sure, okay. Well, the other thing I can just say is a little something about what we plan to do this evening, just to let you know. So our plan for this particular event is that we don't talk in great detail about the specifics of our research collaboration, but we use this evening. The reason for that is because we're going to do another event in May where we'll do that. So please come and join us for that one. But what we'd like to do tonight is take an opportunity to sort of take a step back from the specific project and ask the broader questions, as you said. And so look a bit more generally at dance and neuroscience collaboration and reflect on where that type of an interdisciplinary collaboration can lead. And as you said, to have the help of extremely distinguished guests who we're very fortunate to have with us. Thank you very much for joining us. And I would like to start by introducing Sue, Siobhan Davies, because we not only have to thank you for joining us tonight, but we also have you to thank for creating this building and for creating this particular space where we can have just these kinds of events. And I could say a great deal about Siobhan Davies or Sue, but I can briefly say for anyone who doesn't know Sue that she is a choreographer, a very eminent choreographer, and the artistic director of Siobhan Davies Dance, which is of course resident here in the building.
That's quite enough.
From my perspective, Sue has been a very important mentor to me for many years, and we have collaborated a great deal very closely for many years as well. So it's really fantastic for me to have Sue here tonight. And also, I'm very delighted to introduce Jonathan Cole, who, please tell me if I get this right, is a consultant in clinical neurophysiology at Poole Hospital. Good so far?
Good, very good, yep.
And a professor at University of Bournemouth. And as well as all of that, Jonathan is also an author and has written several books that focus on the subjective experience of neurological impairment.
Very good.
Excellent.
That'll do.
I first met Jonathan a few years ago through Sue, and Sue and Jonathan have an ongoing dialogue. And I've always really enjoyed our conversations. I've always gotten a lot from them. And along with a group of other collaborators, Sue and Jonathan and I are currently at the beginning of a new artistic project as well, so we have something that is cooking. And so I'm really delighted that you could be here today as well. Thanks.
So at this point, I will take over and introduce Dr. Annemieke Apergis-Schoute, who came to us here from Cambridge. And Annemieke did her PhD at New York University with Joseph Ledoux and Elizabeth Phelps, both very important and famous scientists in emotion and cognition. And Annemieke has worked on fear conditioning or learning of emotions in both rats and humans. And she now works at Cambridge University, and particularly with obsessive compulsive patients. And we are working together. We have starting currently on working together on sort of rolling out a movement-based therapy to these sorts of severely impaired patients. And I believe she's also involved in currently in one of, I think it's the only deep brain stimulation project worldwide for these patients who are...
Worldwide, but in England.
But in England at least. But the second one, well, it's worldwide. Worldwide. Where basically patients who are no longer accessible or who basically don't benefit from medication or cognitive behavioral therapy anymore basically get something like a pacemaker implanted in their brains, and that has, and I hope she'll be talking a little bit about that and the relation to movement in this particular case. And then finally, of course, we have on the right side Lutz Förster, who is famous.
That's it.
Which is basically what I mean. Well, Lutz is not only one of the dominant or famous figures for his work with Tanztheater Wuppertal, Pina Bausch, where he currently is artistic director, but it's worth pointing out as well that he has numerous other experiences with figures such as the Limon Dance Company. He has worked with Robert Wilson and Meredith Monk. And not to mention, or also to mention, that he has been the head of the dance department at the German Folkwang University in Essen, where I had the privilege to be one of his pupils, which still stresses me out a little bit in this particular situation now. But it's all going to be fine. And maybe just his latest achievement, he has just been awarded the Leonid Massin Prize for lifetime achievement in dance, which I believe is the oldest dance prize that exists in the world. And previous people being awarded this prize is Rudolf Nureyev, I think, one of them, Mats Eck, for those who know them. So it's quite an amazing prize, and I would like to congratulate him as well for this.
Thank you so much.
Very welcome. I could go on for hours, but I think I'll stop here and hand back to Matthias.
Okay, well, the one thing that I want just to say is I'm not sure if you mentioned that you have a dual background in dance and neuroscience.
I
So that
do
maybe
have a dual background.
You do?
Yes, I do have a dual. Did I mention that? Did I
don't
not
think so.
mention that?
No.
I'm so shy. I don't like talking about myself.
That's not true.
Well, so I do have a dual background in dance and neurosciences. So I do have, I did my PhD in neuroscience in Germany and have worked with Patrick Haggard here in London. I have also danced with a company in Germany for 2 years, which was far too short, but long enough on the other side. And now I'm basically, for those of you who are interested in doing a new master's course, I will start a master's in psychology of the arts and neuroaesthetics at Goldsmiths University within the next 2 years. But that's now finally enough of me.
Yeah, but I think it's really important.
Yeah, it
to
is
say
important
that
to point
because
out. Yeah.
for people who don't know about your dual
Yeah.
interdisciplinary background, it's part of what for me makes our work together really interesting is that you see whatever we do from both angles. So that's really, really unique. So Guido and I have prepared things to talk about and some ways to talk about them. And we would really also like to invite you to help us with these questions. We will if you could, collect your questions up. We're going to have a chat all together at the end. So that's how we'll do it. And the first thing that we thought we'd just very simply do is just start by asking a very basic question. When you think about dance and neuroscience collaboration, in whatever degree of closeness or distance you have to the idea of dance and neuroscience collaboration, what do you think of first? So when you think of dance and neuroscience collaboration, what comes to mind? What do you think of? What do you feel? What are your general intuitions about dance and neuroscience?
What are you curious about this event?
Is this a green moment?
No. The green moment comes later. We're still
We've got to get it right.
Thank you for being poised.
Yeah. What makes you curious about this event?
Well, for me, since I started working with you, I'm just thinking about how can moving help the brain. So, how is moving good for you? Especially after reading in the newspapers all the time now that sitting is so terrible for you. For your brain and for your health. So I think that's what it makes me think about most.
Thank you.
I think something about performance is 360 degrees. So it's not as if neuroscience is going to answer everything, but if I'm looking at how to invest in a performance, either my own or somebody else's, or if I'm trying to find other details in that performance, then within that 360 degrees, this idea of how the brain and the body and the mind and the nervous system and response and sensation and emotion all work together, then the fact that I can study that slightly means that I might be able, or get feedback from that, means that that's part of that 360 degrees.
I got lots of questions in terms of scientists are curious, and scientists' curiosity is driven by ignorance, and they want to understand things. And one way they understand things is they perturb a system and they measure things. So they're trying to dissect things in a way, which is a very different approach to that of dance, which is about experience, about emotion, about doing something that you may not be able to cognitively explain. And it's interesting putting those two together as best we can. My other way of looking at it is that for many years I've studied people, say, who have spinal cord injury who can't move, or, for instance, people who can't move their faces. And if you go to people with impairment, I think it tells you a lot about the experience we will take for granted. Because if you lose something or you don't have it, it really makes you understand what it is that you have. So that's one group of people, but then you have the other group of people who spend their lives becoming experts in various forms of movement, of which dance is one form. So these people sitting over there, so to speak, who just happen to be randomly sitting over there, they've devoted their lives to the expertise of moving, an expressive movement at that, not the ability to move in a way that makes them better writers or makes them better something else, or throwing a dart where the movement is the same. They're expressive experts in movement, and that's an extraordinary thing to try and understand.
For me, sheer curiosity, personal curiosity, because when I was teaching in Essen 12 years ago, Guido started to study, and I found out that he studied psychology. And I was worried, because I don't think you can do two things at a time, but he did in parallel, and it fascinated me. Because in my former life, because I danced, I was studying too, but something completely different, history, French and Russian, so a very different scientific way. And And I was amazed that he was able to do his diploma and then to do his PhD, and then he got a scholarship, went to that, and I said, perhaps there is something about this combination. And when he invited me, I said yes, because of curiosity. Although I have my doubts in the whole thing.
Good. I think the doubts are useful to talk about as well with the fields.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So so one thing that I realized, having attended a number of these sort of dance science collaboration, is that usually a lot of time is spent on defining concepts and trying to find a common language. So we're going to try to do this in a very quick and easy way, in a sort of game-ish style format now for our panel members. So basically what's going to happen is Matthias and I are going to ask a number of short questions which all relate to terms that are used by both dancers and neuroscientists, but which potentially may have very similar or very different connotations. And we're going to put these questions always like a little bit quick through, and then we will go through all of these answers more elaboratedly in a sort of longer sessions. But basically how this works is we're going to ask the questions now, and we just ask the questions.
Yeah. So, and the questions are we're kind of intentionally making it difficult for you, our distinguished panelists. But we'll just see what it, having too little time, trying to do it as quickly as possible, just what it brings up for us to talk about afterwards. So it doesn't matter if they're not your most formulated answers. It can be very, very few words, and if nothing comes up, you can just pass. And our recommendation is that please, when you are done one, that you just turn it over, and we'll collect them up and talk through them from the beginning. And I'm going to even add an annoying sound effect.
Oh, great.
Oh, for pressure.
Just for pressure. Are you ready?
Yes.
Okay, so.
Your question is first.
Do we get £1,000?
Perhaps. Okay, question one.
Makes you think so much better, doesn't it?
What is movement?
You can obviously think about these questions by yourself as well and answer them. Happy for you to join in.
Scientists are very quick.
Luckily, my pen doesn't work.
Oh,
Sorry.
I'll take this one.
Here's
I think
another
this
one.
one might be better as well.
Okay. No, I'm all right. I think I'm all right. I think I just kept the thing on.
You could speed it up.
I could speed it up. Oh no, that's slower. So
No, it's back to front too, isn't it?
that's better. Okay. Oh, is that one up?
I think we hit a snag.
There we go.
Question number 2. What is science? I'm very glad that you have the next question.
Come on, guys, you be doing something.
Sorry.
Great. Okay, next question. What is dance?
Next question. What is research? 2 more to go.
What is progress? It's always possible to pass. Remember.
Well, the scientists have a lot to say on that.
Oh, lots of progress going on.
And finally, what is excellence?
Hui!
Thank you. Finally.
Good.
Now we're going to shuffle them.
Yeah.
It's worse than any exam I ever did.
I'm so sorry.
You have to live with the answer, though. But
Yeah, that's true.
We did a warm-up of this, and they just said, what's your favourite colour? And then they do that on us.
Good. So, if you could please just go back to the beginning, then we can talk through from the start. And maybe when we talk about each one, we will ask you to reveal your answer, and then we can talk about them. So the first question, your answer to movement is, what was it?
Oh.
We can show them all at the same time.
Okay.
Oh.
And then say them, right? Otherwise,
Yeah, we won't
not
see
gonna
My
them.
writing's too small.
Yeah.
Great. Yes, please say.
almost everything.
Movement is almost everything.
Oh, that's good.
Well, the first thing that came to my mind.
I can see where I'm going. Something transformed to another.
Great.
What animals do?
What?
Animals do.
What animals do.
fast, no thinking.
Movement is fast.
Pascal said, our nature lies in movement. Complete calm is death, which you know that it was.
Yeah. In those days it was? Is
Well,
not anymore?
in the sense, I go back to spinal cord injury, you can be a locked-in person and have a rewarding life of sorts, being unable to move entirely anywhere.
But that is, a locked-in person has no large-scale movement, but a locked-in person still has, heartbeat and sort of internal
accepted,
movement. So,
no voluntary movement.
yeah. Because I do tend to think about stillness as a good definition of death, no?
Some sort of
Completely
definition
still,
of
yes.
death. Yeah. Moving is what animals do.
But a brain scan of somebody with locked-in syndrome would still show movement?
It would still show the
Would show
perception
the
or
perc-
intention
of
to move,
movement.
Yeah.
and the memory or the perception of doing movement, imagining movement in some way.
So in some ways, I'm sort of tempted to say that you're going even a step further than Lutz did by saying movement is everything. Yeah? No?
I mean, you could make the claim that if we act in and on the world, we are moving. We require movement to do that. So the old Daniel Wolpert idea, there's a hydra or a small thing that goes around the sea, and it has two parts of its life cycle. One where it moves, and the other where, once it's decided where it's going to stay, that's where it stays forever. And at that point, it digests its own brain. Because it doesn't need to coordinate its body in order to move, so it doesn't need a brain. So Daniel Wolpert, who's in Cambridge, Professor of Engineering, always says that's what the brain does. That's the first thing the brain has evolved to do, move.
And if you think of a fetus in the womb, I'm always fascinated. They're learning by movement because they don't have language and they don't have other extraneous things to inform them. So as they grow, the fact that a fetus grows a body and then must be learning how to deal with that growth, I find that quite extraordinary. And then, of course, that continues.
Yes.
Hopefully.
A fetus will make hand-to-mouth movements in the womb many, many times a day as it gets older. It's not just random movement. They're learning movement patterns, they're practicing in the womb.
Even though they can't, that's comfort or food? It's not food.
I haven't asked them.
I'm not.
I don't know.
It's your next job.
I'm a empirical scientist. You don't know why.
Yeah, so I'm curious about why you said almost everything.
Yeah, because I'm not. How should I say it in English? Ich bin kein Fundamentalist. So I always have to think there might be something else too. And also when we talk about movement, are we only talking about human movement? You know? Is when a thunder hits a tree and it falls down, is a different kind of movement. So that's why I went almost. You have to always leave a door open anyway.
I'm curious about what you wrote about movement is fast and
No thinking.
fast and no thinking. And when you write that, when you wrote that, were you thinking about specific category of movement or all movement?
I'm kind of thinking that probably most of the movements that you do are not carefully planned. So although you do carefully planned movements, I wouldn't know the percentage, that would just be guesswork, but I think that a lot of movements we do, they seem to go so automatic, right? They just go like by themselves. This morning I cycled to the hospital even though I had a meeting in town. And that entire movement of getting there seemed to go by itself.
I've investigated a person who has no perception of movement in his body. So he doesn't know where his arms and legs are unless he sees them. And he relearned to move. It took him nearly 2 years to do that, because without feedback, the brain is completely unable to know how to move and where to move and what to move. And he relearned to move by looking at what he was doing, but also thinking. So he has to think the whole time about how to move, how to sit, how to keep still. And then Matthias did a wonderful thing, which you could probably describe much better than me, but...
Do you mean the thing that Ian and I did together, or...?
No, on the ground.
So Jonathan is referring to a piece that Sue and I made together in 2011, which is called To Hand, and basically it's I put myself in a situation of difficulty in this installation performance, in which I'm balancing on upturned plastic pots, and different parts of my body are all supported by these different plastic pots, so my whole body is off the ground, and I find a way to move ahead by moving some of the base and moving some of my body, and moving some of the base and moving some of my body. And so I think one of the ways in which we have talked about that before is that this is a kind of, I would say a self-imposed task, but could also be seen as a kind of self-imposed impairment, which had some relationships with Jonathan's work with people who have impairment, neurological impairment that impacts on their movement.
Yeah, exactly. Because people, if you lose that automatic movement, that unconscious movement, because after all, many animals who we don't think have the extended consciousness we have are perfectly able to move. If you lose that automatic movement, you're a bit like To Hand, where every movement you have to think, if I move that pot there, then I might tip over that way or whatever. When you become aware of the physics and the weight of your own movements and the difficulty of movement, in a way that's a very graphic way of looking how some people with impairment have to navigate through the world. They have to go as though they're like a climber up a pitch just to walk across a room. That was a lovely way of the way in which a creative piece of art was actually telling us something about the way people with some impairment see the world too.
I think I'm curious to know a little bit, because I'm not so familiar with your work. So I'm curious to know if there's a relationship with your work with OCD patients, and there must be with movement without awareness and movement with awareness.
Well, that's actually where our collaboration comes into place.
Okay.
So OCD patients, they do a lot of repetitive movements. So for example, they'll wash their hands in a very particular fashion, and they need to do it exactly in that way until it feels just right. Or they lock the door, check the stove, or they tap a certain object a certain amount of times. But the weird thing about their movement is, although it's so automatic, and they don't even remember how they've done it or how many times they've done it, they feel an urge to perform this movement, which is very different to what I did this morning when I cycled to the hospital. I didn't feel a great urge to cycle to the hospital. It's much better to have a meeting in town than to go to where I every day go. But they feel an urge to do this kind of movement. And for me, it's just very fascinating, because how do you stop them wanting to do this, and what is the feedback from this movement that you perform so many times? And that's how Guido and I got talking about maybe we can alter this.
Basically, the first, I think actually what came to my mind when you explained to me those features of what a compulsion is, I had to think of a sentence that Dominique Merci once said to me about what makes a good dancer, or what do good dancers do. And I remember he said, well, you know what you're doing.
Yeah, but this is, we're talking about different kind of movements. We're talking about everyday movement, what really happens. And of course, when I usually talk about movement, it's in the perspective of dance, in the perspective of, let's say, theater, in the perspective about stage. And even though you might use an everyday movement, it changes completely as soon as you put it on stage. It's a completely different thing. And even though it might look the same, it's not the same.
There are actually very few psychological theories of the arts that include dance, but one of the few ones that have is a book by two authors called Hans and Schulamit Kreitler, and they wrote a book called Psychology of the Arts, and they asked the question in this book, what is the difference between an everyday movement and a dance movement? And that is an important question, because that's also, it relates to the same question as what is the difference between having an advert for a soup and pop art, which is the picture of an advert for a soup. And what they say is that the difference between dance movement and everyday movement is they use the term remoteness from the habitual. So they say it is that dance movements distinguish themselves from everyday movements by the fact that they are perturbations, or they are something that they are turned in such a way which you would not normally do. That's how they define it.
I don't know. I disagree, actually. But,
Why? Tell, yeah.
I would disagree too.
But
I would disagree too.
But you talked about unlearning, Guido, because you said a big deal of dancing is about unlearning, because if you kind of move about the way you do in everyday life, you can't transmit an image in the same way as you might want to, because it's an artistic specific expression that's not you. You're not going to transmit just Guido out to the world. You have to transmit a feeling or something, and that's why you have to unlearn the way you would naturally move to to specifically?
I don't know. Natural is a very, very dangerous word on stage. It's very, very dangerous. Because I think to look natural takes a big artificial effort.
That's what I mean.
Yeah.
So unlearning, in a sense, that's what
It's
we're talking
completely artificial. And in order to look natural, you have to work a lot. It's one of the most difficult things, I think, on stage, to look natural.
And what happens when movement with an artistic base does not happen on stage but in other spaces? Because then I still can understand that if you are performing in a gallery space, for instance, it still is not natural. But on the other hand, the noticing of that movement has a different distance from audience to performer. It's not the distance that's taken from stage to audience. There's a different measurement, and I get very fascinated and trying to understand that at this moment I have a sense of performance because I'm in front of you. But if I just thought about it a little bit more, I could reduce it just a little enough that you would feel I was with you in the room rather than projecting in the room. And then there's these kind of fascinating places which feel part of our a neurological understanding as much as a performance understanding. I don't know quite what I'm talking about, but I know that there's a distance here that is fascinating about performance or not performing, reality or not reality.
I think performance is performance.
I think it's far more complex than that.
For me, it's the same. Whether there are one person standing a meter from me or whether there are 4,000 people in La Scala watching, it's no difference.
I think it's a very...
For me, it's no different. For me, it's no different. For me, it's no different. Because it's the same natural thing that happens. You know, if a room is small, you don't have to put up the music so loud. And when you are in a bigger, you have to give more volume. And perhaps in a bigger room, and your facilities are not enough to be even heard. But I think that the sensibility to feel how close you are, how many people there are, that is part of our profession.
I quite agree it's part of the profession, but I think the nuance and the subtlety of how you approach that is these skills that we understand as artists and we have developed and layered and layered and layered to the point that we may not always be able to articulate them. And that's why I like a relationship with this other science, because I think to some extent that science gives me a perspective in which I can't say I'm going to understand fully, but I feel I have another kind of engagement with.
It's so much easier when there are few people there. But the feeling, you know, that you lift your hand and you know that 3,000 people are now looking at your hand is fascinating.
Is it easier? It's easier for me to understand.
But of course, you have to get the attention.
You do that.
And that's the difference. And if I raise my hand just in a schoolroom or whatsoever to me there.
That's the difference.
But a theatre actor, say, has to reach row Z, and people said Olivier wasn't a very good film actor because he hammed it up, he overacted because he was used to accentuating things because he was a theatre actor. And there are different disciplines, I understand, in different forms of acting, according to how far away the person that you need to reach is or are. And I wondered if it was the same sort of thing in dance that you're looking at.
There's the other question of the direction. You know, when you talk from here, you have to get to the other. A very wonderful dancer was one of the founding members of the Limon company, Pauline Kohner. She was so small. And in a dispute, she said, getting to the people, me, never. They always had to come to me. And I tell you, they always did. And I like this image, you know. You have to suck the people. they have to come, you have to be open that they're interested to come to you and not to...
But we're talking about performance, and
Yeah.
we're trying to relate this to some kind of your understanding of how we function, how we behave, how we are able to marshal all of these nuances in our sensibility. And I think that's why we look towards you.
Maybe that's a good point to move on to the second question, which was, what is science? Science is, let's have it the scientists first. It is hard to sit still. That is, yeah.
I was still moving, you know.
Yeah.
Right. Oh
Yes.
dear, I'm very boring. I put the pursuit of knowledge, because if you look in an old dictionary, the understanding of knowledge and science are pretty well the same, which has become empirical, by which I mean it becomes more lab-based. And the quote I love, which we were talking to Sue, is from Merleau-Ponty, that science manipulates things. So it wants to change something in order to see what happens and control the conditions under which it does, but it has an idea which way it should fall. So it's got a sort of intelligent way of interrogating what it's looking at, increasingly. But the other end of the Merleau-Ponty saying was science manipulates things, but has stopped living in them. So science also becomes a more temporary phenomenon, where it just perturbs something and tries to look in an acute experimental period, often for a change. Whereas I also think there's a way of understanding, particularly people, where you ask them what it's like to live in the place, the condition they are in.
Thank you.
You didn't write that all on there, did you?
Might have.
I just said revealing, and then the moment I wrote it down, I realised to some extent that's what I think the arts do as well.
I wrote variety, because for me, I have never managed to bring science all together in one pot, because my science experience was in Geisteswissenschaften.
Humanities.
Yeah. And as opposed to Naturwissenschaften. Natural science. And I think already there's such a big difference between these two things that I have a problem to define science in one thing. So because the subjects are so different, and they also require so different methods, so that I only think about variety.
I'd like to suggest that we also include the next answers to the question, what is dance, and then talk about both of these definitions, the field of science and the field of dance. So what was your answer about what is dance? We can start with
Starting with me again.
You look so ready.
I said feeling good while moving and feel the beat.
I had expressive social movement. When we walk from place to place, I'd call that locomotion. That's one form of movement. When you do your shirt up, that's an instrumental action. That's allowing you to do something. When you eat the food, that's doing something. But I'd say dance is expressing something without having to do an instrumental or locomotion. It's not something that does work of itself necessarily. Its aim is to express and to experience. And it is usually in a social situation. So we're social animals.
I dance by myself all the time.
But you've got a virtual other person there, I'd say.
Really?
You're so social that it's difficult
Thank
to be
you.
alone,
I'll
even
take
when
that as
you're
a
alone.
compliment.
Maybe.
So maybe that's an interesting, I mean, let's have the answers first, but that's an interesting thing to put really to you, does dancing require a spectator? But
That's another thing.
step by step. First the paper. First the paperwork.
Throws the paper. Well, I
Throws the
said
paper.
misunderstood.
Oh, excellent.
Because if the great answer about science is variety, I to some extent think we are not as conscious of the variety of dance and movement. So I keep throwing myself, I'm like confetti. I'm doing everything, sorry. So in a way I feel we're misunderstood because we have not as yet celebrated how much variation there can be.
Answering in such a way of, because I try to really take the first, I think just one word, is of course, when you hear what is dance, is it what I think it should be or what it is? And there's a big discrepancy between these two. But in order to think what I wish it was, is life. Which is mostly not true, but that's another question.
And when you say what it is as opposed to what you wish it would be, do you mean what it can? You don't mean what it can be, what it actually can be. You mean
When it, for me, it is, when it reaches me, it is life.
I had a malicious thought I didn't put down, which is dance is a living for some people.
I don't think that's not malicious.
Okay.
I don't think
It's
so.
hopeful.
Yes.
Hopeful.
Indeed. Yeah. I don't know. I feel like there's something that I'm hearing from several things that we've been talking about this. In a way, the border between, for instance, something natural and something removed from the natural, a bit like you were saying in relation to performance. But I feel like that's very similar to what you had just said about, was it Merleau-Ponty talking about science? That also, when this part of what I remembered you saying about scientists stopped living in the thing. So again, there's this sort of like removal or this sort of like abstraction in both of those, and I'm just sort of noticing that. And so I'm kind of leading towards these as perhaps different spaces of investigation that are in relationship to experience, in relationship to.
I can probably find a slightly more malicious word for that.
Yeah.
It sounds like, what both of you are saying, that both science and performing require a certain level of objectification. That is, you can't be in it. You need to sort of take a step back and be sort of in control of what's happening. So it is not, there seems to be an element, if I understand correctly, of not really being fully in there, like you can't do it, you can't experience it for yourself, but you need to take a step back and sort of control or be more sort of conscious and more controlling about what you're doing. Is that true, or am I going on the wrong track
Not
now?
true.
Not true.
Well, that's not my answer.
No,
So
it's not your
No, I
answer.
think
dancing for me is like just about how you feel. So that's what I said. I dance close by myself, you know, in the kitchen and stuff.
So it's being in it. In that
It's
way.
being in it completely.
But there's a joy in the complexity, because yes, there are moments in which, if I could speak for myself, there are times in which I've had to perform in which there's no time to reflect on what one's doing too much, because that's the point where you need all the expertise to arrive at a moment of exactitude and pleasure and all of, you know, whatever, maybe not pleasure, not when you're performing, but exactitude. But in the rehearsal room, this is one of the fascinations about being a dance artist, is you are both trying to be the movement and then reflect on it and then judge it, and then be the movement and then be the outsider and reflect on it and judge it. And it's this constant circle of trying to have enough at your fingertips that everything is going to go out to this audience just at the moment when you ask of yourself to do that. but during the preparation time, you've had this feedback loop in much the same way as I get a feedback loop when I do this, and the man with no proprioception doesn't have that. I'm relying on this feedback loop the whole time in order to be able to assess something that is happening to me at that moment, and that then I want to make expressive.
But I think that's amazing, because for me then, both ways I can be in it. Because when I dance myself, I don't have anybody to perform to usually. And you know, when I'm perceiving dance, it's the same. You get completely absorbed by it. It's like you know, it's like going the same way as going to a concert is watching a dance show. For me, you're just in it.
I sort of.
I'm looking at you.
What are you looking at me? No, because what is dance? I mean, of course, dance is one of the perhaps the oldest form of physical, of human expression. And of course, one has to make distinctions of everybody should dance. Fine, I mean, but when we come to the point that people pay to look other people who dance, people who are dancing, for these people who pay, they have a responsibility. And that changes, I mean, theater all over, whatever it is, and that changes the perspective completely.
Yeah. I think,
yes, go.
Yeah. I sort of felt, I think Sue talked about, like when you talked about the process of being in the rehearsal studio leads us nicely to our next question, which is, what is research?
Yeah.
And so I will probably put that together as well. Or maybe let's just get the answer. Let's just get the paperwork done, and then we see how we go through and whether we put it together with the next ones. So, what were the answers on what is research?
Start that.
Exactly.
Fair enough.
I'm always looking to the left.
Asking.
Yeah.
I went hard work.
I had a discipline refining science. I'm a scientist usually to satisfy curiosity or whatever the question you're looking for.
I had finding the truth experimentally.
Are these all answers that might possibly apply to both dance practice and scientific practice? Would we all be? Is that something where we even might be very intuitively able to agree on that all these answers would fit into both?
All the past answers?
All the past answers to research?
Oh.
So
Yeah.
we had asking,
Hard
hard work,
Refining. Yep.
and
That's the next one.
Finding the truth experimentally.
And a discipline, refining.
I could agree.
yeah? Fine, great. Next question.
We'll just slide.
So, what is progress?
Success.
Success. Progress.
Oh, they just want like sort of sing through the room.
Very good.
More room to move.
Ooh. I
like
had
that one.
a different forms, if you like. Understanding, knowledge, empathetic understanding of others, greater social cohesion. It depends how you define it.
I had going up, answering more questions, and gaining knowledge, which is power.
Oh, I can see we're not going to get through this one that quickly.
In that case, we should just move on to the next one.
No.
Go ahead.
No, I'm curious about like, so you wrote success. I'm curious there was like a in the room. So I want
perhaps have to explain
Yeah.
a bit, but what was the question?
what is progress?
Progress. Because it's, I think, when you work on something, you know, and it's such a great feeling if you just get one step further, you know, and in terms of just the personal experience of progress, it is a little feeling of success.
No, that's,
Indeed.
A perspective. In order, progress suggests some sort of movement towards or movement from. So, in a way, I mean, I don't know, do you need to say progress is in a direction, is something we're going towards? Otherwise, something might be a regressive movement. You know, you think of lots of regressive things that have happened in politics, over, you know, things that are progressive, that we think probably are in a direction we might like or encourage. So one person's progress might be another person's the opposite. So it has a perspective.
Yeah.
Is that fair?
I have to admit I had another idea to write down, which I didn't, because I thought I used the more positive one. The other one was first step.
First step.
But still,
I'm intrigued. Two things. So still I'm intrigued, first of all, why success should have a negative connotation. And then secondly, I think what I'm trying to get at a little bit, or what we were trying to get at this question is, I have this sort of idea, and maybe that's just me, that sort of science requires progress in order to make sense. There needs to be scientific progress. And I wasn't quite sure whether art or dance requires progress. Is there something like progress within the work or over the centuries?
I think we define, I mean, for me, it's probably a different definition.
What kind?
A more personal one, not you know, artificial progress that brings the world further to whatever, or it's more personal. You know, it's more intimate.
Yes, I think if you're, could I progress through my life? And I don't know that that's true. You can imagine, would like to imagine that I progressed, but actually what I'm doing is dealing with the circumstances of every minute, every hour, every year. So that gives that so much of a fluctuation, whereas in science, but this is where I'll sound naive, it does seem to arrive at a place which can support a lot of people. But then, of course, the arts do it. Like if we write a novel at a particular period of time, and that novel speaks to that era and the people in the future, then there is some kind of collective knowledge that has been brought about. But it does seem to be much more personal.
I don't know if you'd call this progress, but one of the things that artists do, I think, is they go beyond the experience of most people and then reveal that in some way, and then people catch up with them sometimes. So, I mean, Stravinsky's Rite of Spring, people were not prepared for it, but now we know it. And they went ahead of what most people's experience in music is. And you might say experimental novels do that usage. People weren't prepared at some stage for that, and now they've caught up. So artists reflect, but the times they're in and many other things, but they can also point us in directions that most of us are not maybe aware of at the time. So in that sense, there is
kinship to science.
There is a progress.
Yeah.
Ahead of progress, which never happens in science.
Yeah.
It does.
No?
You're right.
No?
Yeah.
I
No?
don't feel. Do you ever feel ahead of a question that you want to answer? I always feel like, you know, one answer brings about more questions in science.
Yeah, but
that
in
could be
science there are
arts.
specific things which are progress. I mean, the invention of whatsoever, of film, of electricity. I mean, these is concrete things of progress. I don't think in these terms in dance, because I don't think we deal with progress. It's not important. It's not important in the arts. Progress is not important. It's not a subject for me.
But yes, I'm agreeing with you. But how do we, but I don't know if this is right for, for our discussion, but how do we, there's an evolution that we're going through, either as a private artist on ourselves, and actually you see all of the other artists around you, and you feel that to some extent you're part of a movement at that particular time. So that doesn't necessarily reflect on progress, but it does feel as if there's a connectivity, and that it's not necessarily a forward moving, but it's a collective. Is it collecting, even if there are a bunch of individuals? And could that be redefined as progress? I don't know. Could that be spoken about?
I mean, there is some kind of progress which I'm not interested in, because there's a, like if you see ballet, there's a technical progress in what people can do today as before, technically, which doesn't interest me. It's like in sports, okay, they can go further. But do you call this progress?
No, it's a good word. I mean, it's
and
it's
I don't know. I only can take it for a specific task, production, or whatsoever, to have a feeling of progress, but not in the term of the dance itself.
Yeah, I think, but
I'm worried about the progression of time.
You are worried about the progression of time.
yes.
It's
Oh
like-
God.
well, we're at the last. We were just in front of the last question.
I know.
Yeah.
We need questions from the audience.
Yes, we do need questions.
What was the last question?
Last question.
Right.
What is
Last-
excellent?
What is excellent?
Excellent. Over there.
Let's ask the audience.
Well, let's open up to broader questions in a minute, but yeah, your answer, please.
Excellent. I said best enjoyment.
Excellence is best enjoyment.
So I had an effective emotional part of it too, doing or thinking something that you or others think is good.
Doing or thinking something that you or others think is good.
Trouble.
What?
Trouble.
Trouble.
Because?
Because that is so hard. I don't know why one wants to pinpoint it. I don't know why what is excellent to me I never think of myself as excellent, but should I get near there, what is excellent in one moment is not excellent the next minute, the next second. It can't be. So I can't hold it.
It's difficult for me to say something because I don't like this word, excellence. It's so abused with things. But if I just think about something that is important for me in dance, okay, that's my perspective, where I feel it's excellent, which means it gets to me. I wrote craft and emotion, and put the things in order because there's no order to it. Because the problem is, when I see craft without emotion, I'm bored. If I see emotion without craft, I think it's embarrassing. But if you get these two things together, you might reach excellence.
I think it's interesting that, on the one hand, like from people who
know, like both of our panels, people who know there is an incredible reluctance to define what excellence might be. And yet, in the real world, like all of us, both scientists and artists, we are constantly forced, or not forced, but we have to constantly define what it is. Either when we apply for grants or people need to be selected, which papers are published, what papers there is a selection process in place that presumably works on excellence. And yet it seems so hard to say something about it.
And the same occurs for the arts. Which choreographers become shown? Which ones are programmed? How do we decide that? So it seems to be that even though it seems to be important to define excellence in that sense and to do it in a useful way, even though it seems hard.
think that's something that I suddenly said.
I think
Part 2.
Yes. I think part 2 perhaps should be opening up to the audience.
Yeah, I think maybe we should briefly, we should frame in the yeah.
So I think we should open up to the audience, but so what we initially had planned, but what we can still do
is basically based on these sorts of topics that we have covered, sort of now move a little bit, put things together and ask ourselves the question, so what, if anything, can dance practice learn from science and the other way around? What can science learn from dance practice? And I remember that my supervisor, a PhD supervisor or postdoc supervisor, said that one thing that kind of impressed me was that he said that he finds it very easy to see what science can learn from dance, but that he finds it very difficult to see what dance can learn from science. But maybe that's a discussion we should not only have with amongst us, but also with the audience.
Yeah, great. And I think we have a roving mic. Thank you very much, Judith.
Yeah.
So please, if you could let Judith know if you have a question saved up, which may be more or less closely related to what Guido just said. Thanks.
Going back to, is this on? Yes.
Yeah.
Going back to notions of progress in science, I guess one naive view of science is it's the discipline of building models of the world and then trying to exercise them and see whether they are good models or bad. And I guess you could view scientific progress as kind of building models, attempts to disprove them, prove them wrong, and whilst not doing so, the model becomes stronger. And then at some stage, a model is proved wrong, and the next stage then is some sort of paradigm shift and new models. So I wonder whether that view of scientific progress has parallels in artistic practice and maybe in dance practice, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Absolutely. Just the thing that comes to mind for me, which you might also be thinking of, is I can't remember it exactly, but the way that Stellark talks about the purpose of or what art, the potential of art, something like generating contestable futures or something like that. I can't remember the exact wording, but it's similar to this sort of creating models of the world, but possible futures rather than actual presence, I think, in this case. Shall we take another question unless someone has another comment on that one? Yes.
So my question is based on, to start with, towards neuroscientists. Do you believe that consciousness is limited or generated by the body or the mind? And that leads into dance. Is it the I that wills the dance to move, or is it another force that is acting out and the eye is observing it? And this field that we're talking about, is this a bridge between these two places, that we're touching into an ether that we are then trying to catch up with?
Okay. Once we get into consciousness, I can say, actually, this is very interesting because during my PhD I took a course on consciousness, and I had to write an entire sort of mini thesis on this, and I handed this in, and the guy, Ned Block was his name, and he studies consciousness, and he said, you should become a philosopher. And I thought, oh, that sounds like an insult, but I'm very happy to receive A+. So this is what I can say from that piece that I wrote on that, was that you mentioned before the word models got mentioned, and I thought, well, what about if consciousness is, why does everybody make it so complicated? It's just about integrating information. So I don't even think that everybody is at the same level of consciousness all the time. I think just it's about how much information can you integrate, and part of that is sensory feedback, motor feedback, feedback from auditory input, vision, everything that comes together in your brain, and you have to make sense out of it. And that's kind of how you build a model of the world. And I think we have much more complex ones than, let's say, ants or even cats and dogs. But I think all of them are different levels of consciousness in that way, if you think about it like that. And that's how I've written this piece. And even if you are a little human being just growing and learning about the world and learning how to move, you're basically increasing your consciousness because you're learning to integrate more and more. And I think that's the only thing really that's interesting about consciousness, is about how much you can integrate. And I think if you take things away like movement or proprioception or perception, then you strip away so much of consciousness, because there's so much less to integrate, that you actually become less conscious. And that's why I think perhaps maybe, you know, during sleep and those kind of different states, or when you're not moving, you're actually less conscious because there's less to integrate. And that was my little talk about consciousness and integration.
If it's from a dance perspective, it can feel to me as if the I is a construct made up of choice or influence or perspective, or whereas I sense that the whole body has absorbed information at a different cognitive level. And how do I remove from the sort of wrong idea of the peak of I, and make quite sure that that falls away down through the archive of bodily experience that I have had, and we have all had all our lives. Somehow a book that is in the process of helping me work this out is Guy Claxton's, and I can't remember the
Intelligence in the Flesh.
Intelligence in the Flesh. So I'm in my first read of it, but I feel he also has a way of allowing us to think about it, which has been very, very helpful so far. I just have to go back and read it more before I can explain it to you. He talks about welling up, and I find so that how are we more able to allow that which can well up in us without us editing it from this slight I position?
There was an experiment done with a hand moving like this.
Yes.
Scientists were trying the welling up to will to action. The welling up to will to action. And then they asked them to say, tell me when you move your hand. And the well up to action was before the I chose to move the hand. Who is willing the hand to move?
Yeah.
And it's a very interesting thing, because that's something else. It's something beyond. And it's a very powerful place when I see that, someone embodying that and showing us that. And where does that come from in the brain? Or is it not in the brain?
But
Where does it come from?
It could be that
It is
the
in the
body is the brain at that moment. I mean,
Yeah.
or the body is that motor, that out. There's no word I can find
Yeah.
at the moment.
Yeah.
But I think that's a very important difference that you're bringing out about awareness and consciousness, because just because you, which is also your brain, is not aware of that you're going to do that, which is also your brain, is just one part of your brain ahead of the other part of the brain.
Just on that point, and then I'll finish the last thing, is that there's another research done on the heart, that the heart reacts to things before the brain does. So the heart will react to things outside of time and space. So a door, if you walk through a door, before you walk through the door, the heartbeat, the amplitude of heartbeat carries information that changes before the physical event has actually happened. So some parts of your body, not your brain, can react to and be scientifically tracked, to react to a phenomenon before its physical manifestation to the usual sensory perception. And I find this extremely fascinating, that there is...
Coming back to what we said earlier on the science side of this, consciousness was something, when I was a boy, you couldn't talk about it because we couldn't define it and it was too big. So you were allowed to talk about, say, selective attention. And in those situations, your attention is not directed towards something which is reacting and producing a change in you, but you're not aware of it. Your attention is not there. at another level, the welling up, what you can have reflexive consciousness, you're aware of being aware. One of the joys of dance or reading or theatre or running for me is you lose that sense of the I that Sue was talking about. You just become at one with the movement. And there's a glorious sense that you're no longer having to be aware, you're just enjoying the moment. You're in the flow in another way. So that's when sometimes we want to get rid of that critical sort of thing that we have, that we carry around of being aware of being aware. We just want to be in something.
But that's just ultra-conscious.
Yeah.
But how does this relate to what we said earlier, to the idea of that performing is a little bit, is exactly the opposite of that? It's not just the welling up, but the sort of knowing what you're doing at the same time. Does that not require exactly that level of control that we are now just talking about? Another thing that I wanted to say is to quote another famous neuroscientist. If Daniel Wolpert says the brain is all about allowing you to move, there's another famous neuroscientist here in London, Carl Friston, who would say that the brain is all about prediction. So it is all like the main focus of the body and why it has evolved is to foresee the future. That's what everything is about. That's what your memory is for, that's what your brain is for, to order to anticipate what's next. And that is the reason why you have a brain.
And then
May I say
What's
something?
next?
Those are not incompatible.
No, they're not.
They're just
they're not
different
at all.
levels of evolution of this thing that's in here.
exactly.
Yeah.
The brain for a dancer can be a pain in the ass. Because I think it's very important during your life, as a performer, as a choreographer, to have a consciousness about your surrounding, about what you see in the world, what happens, to see how people react, about emotions, and you suck in all this information. And then, in the process of finding something, as a dancer or as a choreographer, you have to get rid of your brain, and you have to let something out that is perhaps through all this information in your body, and just see what happens if you stop thinking. And then, if you found this, and if you then put this together, and then of course you need an incredible awareness to reproduce it, and to reproduce it for 1 year, for 2 years, or for some pieces I did for 30 years, and to still fill it with the same emotion, but it only works with a very strong awareness. How this functions, I don't know. And I don't want to know. I want to keep this secret how it is functioning.
Apparently there's a bit of a rugby tournament going on.
A bit of
a rugby tournament.
Yeah.
You may not be aware.
Yeah.
But I've read of a player who the first time he came on, he played however long, 80 minutes, couldn't remember a thing of what he'd done because he was so emotionally involved and he was doing expert movement, making decisions the whole time. He had lost, if you like, that historical autobiographical memory that we lay down and where we were and what we were doing. And I wondered if during dance, when you come off having done the best dance you've ever done, or a really good dance, a dance you feel is excellent, can you remember what you were doing?
But the personal perception is so different, Sometimes you think this was a great performance, and you look in the eye of the choreographer and it wasn't. And vice versa. I mean, the result is difficult to judge. I mean, I think it's always so stupid, because you're also, just when you finish, you're in a very, in a sort of emotional state, even in I don't know how it is here in Germany, if you have a car accident, for instance, after a performance, and you had just done a performance, you have mildernde Umstände.
mitigating circumstances.
Yeah.
Oh, that was very
In
Sorry,
court.
what?
Mitigating circumstances.
No, that's
You know?
very
I think
serious there.
For me, it's always so stupid when I'm not in sports, but of course you see it, you know, when people have done a football game, you know, a soccer game, you know, and they just up there and there's a microphone and they have to analyze what they've just done. I mean, it's so stupid. I mean, how can you do that? Perhaps you have to think about 2 or 3 days and then you know what was done. But of course, there has to be a consciousness of what you've done, because you're not always lucky that you're alone on stage. There are 20 other people around you, and you have to be very aware of, in relation to the other people, that you're at the right spot and the right time and the right and of course, when you go off, this is in your head. It's not like, oh, I didn't know what I've done tonight. I mean, no, of course I know what I've done.
But is this also why I feel very fascinated by the neuro system? Because why are we dividing it into these big chunks, emotion, thought, feeling, brain, body? If there's a fully working neurosystem, it feels as if it's so much more about that integration, and that there are the molecule in which I might be sensing something emotional is right next door to the molecule which is dealing with a thought. You know, it's not like that, I know, technically, but it just feels as if it's this collectivity, it's this constant interplay, and that dividing these things into these big chunks is helpful because of words, it's helpful because of language, but it's not how we exist. And we can apply ourselves, we can decide that we need to think about something, and we can decide to let go of the thought and try and get the feeling, but in fact we're doing it all. And it's a question of, and that's why I feel I am enjoying listening to people who work in neuroscience, because they give me another kind of language, they collect me together in a slightly different way, they explain partially something that I feel my body knows, but that I'm now in the presence of somebody who has articulated it from a different point of view, and that's incredibly exciting. And it doesn't always work, and I'm certainly not going to be able to translate it. It's just coexisting with that kind of understanding.
I think that is a really wonderful moment actually to end on, because we are even over our overtime. And we had lots of other things planned. But
I think we have time for this. It takes just 3 minutes, no?
Okay.
I think I'm...
Guido wants to play another game.
I want to play another
If you're
game.
up for it. It's
Finally.
very brief.
It's very brief. So every one of you has these cards here in front of you. And it's a nice wrap-up. It will go very quickly.
Now we can continue with the bigger discussions in the bar.
Exactly. But just to all wrap it up and to make it sort of nice, Matthias and I have a sequence of 8 questions. The yellow one means you agree. The red one means you disagree. The panel members will join as well. If you are not sure, if you feel torn, you hold up both. You can also wrap them apart if you hated everything or whatever. Anyway, so we'll put forward the questions now. And I think if I can find my document, I think I need a bit of confetti now. It's getting a bit... I think this is the right one. Yes, right. Question 1. Can we have some music? I think we should have the music.
But then we won't hear you.
Oh, we won't hear me. Maybe that's a good thing. Right. Question 1. Everyone can be a dancer.
Great. Next question.
Next question. Everyone can be a scientist. Slightly more disagreement on that one.
I'll make my bloody mind up.
Art helps scientific progress. Art helps scientific progress. Yeah,
Oh, yes.
Good agreement on that one. Science helps artistic progress. Yeah, it's a bit of a mixed-up question as well. So a lot of confused answers for a confused question.
Yeah.
I enjoyed this event.
Enough no's.
Enough no's. I feel I have learned something. Oh, that's nice. Thank you very much. All my questions have been answered.
And all my answers have been questioned. That's very clever, isn't it?
Very good.
Thank you very much. We'll see you at the bar.
Thank you so much.
And of course, a massive thank you to our distinguished and very tall panel, as we noticed on the entrance.
Thank you all.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
And thanks to our chair and organisers.